So hi everyone, Tim Biffin. I'll be sort of quick today, but first thing I wanted to discuss, sort of just throw some numbers around about is early weaning. So I'm not sure how many people practice these through this area, but essentially, like the first thing I put in here is a bit of a table, which is just to identify that, if you can get the babies off earlier and get them looking after themselves, so metabolising the food for themselves and not sucking the life out of mum, you'll actually, you actually reduce the amount of input that you have to put into that production system. And so this is just some pretty standard figures, that I've applied. So if we go, all right, so we've got a cow and a calf. Let's say if it's at, 14 weeks or something like that. Together as one unit, they're going to be eating sort of about 13 kilos of hay, whereas that exact same unit, the total input required for maintenance there drops down to about 11.5 once you get the calf off. And similar sort of thing for the ewes and lambs, you're going to drop about a kilo of hay requirement if you can get that lamb off early. So obviously, why do we do it? So better production for less feed, but obviously there are some risks involved. If it's, if it's not done in a considerate way for the lambs, or, you're going to stress them out or yard them and mark them or something like that at the same time, or you do it too early for the lambs, obviously they're going to die. That's pretty common sense. I guess, I have to throw this sort of thing in there. Things are dry, and people, I think, sometimes associate, and sort of rightfully so a bit, associate things like pulpy kidney when there's lots of green feed around, or you change them to lush feed. Certainly that's a bit more of a risk when you're doing that kind of thing. But they can still get those diseases in dry time. So we've got to make sure that we're still drenching. They'll still get worms. So we've got to make sure we're still, we're still considering internal parasites, so drenching them. Considerations surrounding like it is difficult, but trying to separate your mobs out, so you're looking after your tails a bit differently, or your single bearers as compared to twin bearers, if that's something you're able to facilitate, will help to keep these guys alive. One of the last points there is, is it economically viable? Like if you're early weaning, is it actually, do some sums surrounding how much you're going to feed. Is it actually worthwhile early weaning and then selling off the young stock as compared to keeping them for whatever reason? So I've literally lifted these figures out of New South Wales DPI resources, so you can either scribble down figures or look them up on the net later, or ask me and I can email them to you directly. But they're just some rough targets for, and I haven't done research in this area, so that's why I say I've literally lifted them out of the DPI resources. But for cattle, if they're older than 6 weeks of age, you want to be aiming for this sort of 80 to 140 kilos for early weaning targets. And then, we'll talk about, you'll see this sort of thing come up throughout the presentation, and Jim will cover, energy units a lot more, but you'll see like MJME, which is just think of it, is just a measure of unit for energy. So you're talking about 13 units of energy, is going to be required as input into that system for the calves. And then, if you're doing it a bit later, which might give you a bit more flexibility in terms of what management you have to do with the animals, so that they've got a bit more in terms of their own reserve, so they can put up with a little bit more at about 12 weeks of age, aiming for that 140 to 200 kilos. And you don't need as much energy in terms of, the units. So sheep, 8 week, there is the potential, I put this in here, 8 weeks, there is the potential, a very real potential to wean a lamb at 8 weeks. Lambs, once they get to 8 weeks of age, their ability to metabolise every unit of energy that goes into their body is relative to an adult animal. Now, if you go earlier than that, it's less. So let's say, you get a 6 week lamb and you try and pull it off mum, it's not able to metabolise every unit of energy that you put in at the same rate that a ewe is, so it's less efficient. So let's say you're using like 80% or something of that energy, that lamb is probably going to go into stress, nutritional stress, and start using its own reserves, and they really don't have reserves when they're that young. So that's why we're getting the mortalities like starvation if you wean them too early, and their gut's also not used to eating feed, obviously. So at least 8 weeks of age, if and there's all sorts of strategies to getting to that, but I won't delve into that. But ideally you want about a 20 kilo live weight of those animals. If you're doing this though, this is where the considerations surrounding, you just got to be tactful with your marking with these lambs. So you wouldn't do it at the same time. You probably, you want to delay that, the stress of going through that process. All right, so what I actually really want to get through with you guys today is, some of the what we call metabolic diseases that I've been seeing a fair bit of lately across the region, like you'll hear people talk about fatty liver syndrome and milk fever and grass tetany and all sorts of staggers associated with lambing and lambing sickness. Really, like I'd put it into a scope of 3 different diseases for you, and they're related to 3. They are 3 separate diseases, but they do often act hand in hand around lambing or around calving. And so the first one being what you hear, lambing sickness or calving sickness, sometimes called fatty liver syndrome or ketosis, pregnancy toxemia, but essentially they're all a word for, like they're all names for a lack of energy or energy deficit. Whereas when you hear people talk about milk fever, you think milk, calcium, that's actually a calcium deficit. Whereas people talk about grass tetany, that's related to magnesium. And it is important to understand the difference because obviously in preventing them, if you want to prevent milk fever, you've got to provide calcium because that's the deficit. Whereas if you want to stop pregnancy toxemia or lambing sickness, you've got to provide energy. Jim later on will go through, like energy is that key component there, and we'll, I'll leave that. I'll let Jim talk about that because he'll do it better than me. So pregnancy toxemia, lack of energy. Some of the factors here, really often they're twin bearing, and that has a double whammy because they've got a belly full of lamb, so they can't actually eat as much as what they normally would because there just physically is not the space inside their abdomen. Also, their energy requirements are huge relative to if they were dry or if they had a single. That's pretty common sense. So what do you guys notice? Well, common presentation for me is farmer rings up and says, they're at the point of lambing, or they're a week or 2 off lambing, and my twin bearing ewes, some of my singles, but I'm just finding them down, or sometimes I'm just finding them dead. Often pre-lambing too in ewes. Cattle, we don't tend to get this condition in our beef cattle. Dairy cattle, it's different, but this is largely a condition of sheep in our area. And so when we open them up, I'll often see the images. I might just close this curtain here. But a pale, what we call a fatty liver, when you do a killer and you see the liver, like it's sort of your boot leather brown colour, like what a normal liver looks like. This image here probably shows it well. It's really quite pale and it does stand out. Whereas in the other conditions I'm going to talk about, like milk fever and grass tetany, so the calcium and magnesium one, it actually shows there's no change. So I say to farmers when I think it's hypocalcaemia or milk fever, I say, when I do this post-mortem, we're actually not going to find anything like in this carcass that looks particularly abnormal. And that's a really useful thing to know. So how do you, in terms of preventing this or in terms of what do you need to know for this kind of thing is, so your big girls, and your pregnant girls, they really need support with energy. So concentrated energy feed, things like grain. And I say to farmers too, like, if you don't have them on grain, it's even a good idea just to have them trailing like a token gesture of grain going into lambing. And the reason being, if things start getting a bit tight for them, or you notice one or two go down, then you can rapidly, you can more rapidly increase the grain that they're being provided than if they weren't already on grain. Because the alternative then that I say, if they're not already used to grain, is you've got to go buy lupins or something like that you're not going to give them acidosis with if you're going to put out a large amount for them. I think that probably covers it. Hypocalcaemia, so this is the milk fever one. Often a farmer will call me, and sometimes we'll notice a bit of twitching, a bit of staggering. So sometimes you might notice that, not always. Again, a lot of the time the call is my ewes are down. I've woken up and 4 ewes are down. And I don't know why. They're either coming into lambing or they're coming out of lambing. Again, less common in our beef cattle. How do you give calcium? Well, how do you guys prevent this? Well, most farmers, I think, understand that, we give lime, and lime is a good source of calcium, and that's pretty much correct. There are different tricks as to how to get it into them. So most people, I think farmers around this area are pretty well versed in using like a stock grade lime, salt, and a magnesium mineral mixed up together, and you can mix that in third portions, like 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, which I think is fine. You might want to drop the magnesium off a little bit because it tends to be a bit bitter, and we do know that like unpublished work through the DPI in Wagga, like they found at any one time, sort of common sense, at any one time, sort of 20% of the mob or so are not going to actually go for that lick. And so you've got 20% of animals at risk there, which is pretty significant. Other strategies might be going equal quarters, and the fourth quarter being a bag of grain, just to make it a bit more palatable, or considering multiple different routes of providing this mineral supplement. So you could mix it as a wet lick, like adding molasses or something like that, or even buying a commercial wet lick that has molasses in it and the other products. Obviously making sure there's plenty of trough space for them. It's in multiple locations, certainly around where they're camping, that kind of thing, where they're feeding, where they're getting water. Yep, I think that's probably all I need to cover there. Okay, so hypomag, so grass tetany, is less common in sheep in this area and much more common in beef cattle, and certainly when the cow is lactating. And oftentimes farmers will call me and say, I lost a cow last night, or I just found her dead. I don't think I've ever seen beef cattle in this area twitching, but they certainly can get like a bit wobbly on their feet, a little bit staggery, which is why it gets the name grass tetany. And so why do they get this? Well, a big explanation is our potassium content in a lot of the feed that we have here. So a lot of our cereal crops, if they're out on pasture, and grain particularly, is relatively high, in potassium, and then relatively low in magnesium and calcium. And so it just prevents them getting it. So you do, like particularly beef cattle, when they're lactating, my opinion is you really need to have a magnesium mineral supplement out for them. I will strongly caution you against using lick blocks and thinking that you're providing enough magnesium for them. I did a quick calculation before this, just looking at the common commercial lick blocks that are available. I just find cattle producers, more so than sheep producers, tend to, in the cattle enterprise, but a lot of you guys will have both sheep and cattle, in the cattle enterprise tend to rely a bit more on on lick blocks compared to the loose licks, which is more common, I find, in sheep, like the powder loose lick. But yeah, the common commercial lick blocks have about 4 grams per entire 20-litre block of magnesium. Now, if we consider a beef cow, standard lactation, is probably going to need about 2 grams per day. So each cow. So that means that, one cow has to eat half a block to get her daily her daily intake. So it really just, there just is not sufficient quantities there for them. Before I move on from minerals, the other thing that I really want to sort of instill on producers here today is that particularly ewes going into lambing, that last particularly last 2 weeks before lambing, that is when their mineral requirements and energy requirements, and Jim will cover energy a bit more, their mineral requirements go significantly higher, and then throughout lactation and so throughout lambing. And I think there are certain theories about coming into lambing, let's reduce their calcium content so they start relying on their bone structure. They start mobilising calcium from their reserves within their bones, which there certainly is science behind that. It's something that it tends to be more applicable to dairy medicine, and is quite and dairy medicine. They have quite tightly controlled rations, so it is a lot more appropriate there. I think certainly 8 weeks out, that kind of thing, you can play around with that kind of thing in sheep. But in the last 2 to 4 weeks, it is inappropriate to not have a mineral supplement out to them, because they will die. Certainly in that last 2 weeks, if you go, I've got mineral supplement, I'm going to pull it away now, 4 weeks before lambing, you will have hypocalcaemia in that mob. It will definitely happen, particularly twin-bearing ewes. Just need to nail in, don't forget other husbandry practices, vaccines, we spoke about that, drenching, if we're lot feeding, that kind of thing. I'm sure some of you might have questions for Jim about how to do that a bit, but considerations throughout it. If you're going to put in a lot, where's the effluent and stuff going to go, because that will increase the risk of things like worms and other bacterial infections that they could get, and increasing, when just like shows or us here today, if someone's got the flu, we'll probably all walk away with the flu. When you're increasing density and increasing contacts with other people or other animals, there is the greater propensity for disease to spread through the mob. So consider, certainly, hygiene's really important then. And making sure they're up to date with routine practices. This slide I was asked to throw in there. Lisa and Jeff are probably better people if you've got questions about lupin anthracnose, but we're currently in our final year for surveillance of the disease. So as many of you probably know, we had an incursion of lupin anthracnose, which is an exotic disease in lupins to New South Wales, and in trade you can't just say, oh, I don't have something. You've got to actually prove that you don't have it. And so it says July, August. I thought it was September, but so July, August apparently. The surveillance is occurring in September, and it says in July, August we'd like to hear from you. So particularly like to hear about what. If you are planting lupins and what varieties you're using, because that information needs to be used to develop a surveillance program to be able to say to our trading partners, this is where we've assessed from and we've found no anthracnose. So, and in our last lot, we didn't find any. So hopefully we get the all clear again and then we're done. Cool.
Yeah, with our late break, I think there's going to be less in than what was anticipated.
Cool.
All right, thanks, Tim. Questions to Tim, and just a comment before any questions. Last night at Week Valley we had about 55, 60 people, and there'd been actually 5 property visits for pregnancy toxemia, so they're doing it pretty tough out there at the moment. Some of them have been feeding for 8 months. But basically 5 out of 55 people had already been impacted by lambing sickness or pregnancy toxemia. So there's a bit of it around.
I mean, you'll always get some, like ewes, you know, Jim's going to bring up, use the mouse there, Jim. Like Jim's going to bring up some units of energy required for animals at different stages, and like when you do the calculations surrounding particularly twin-bearing ewes in lactation, you know, it is physically impossible for them to eat their energy requirements, so they will 100%, they're going to use their energy reserves, so they will go into nutritional stress, and you know, the difference is how long and how harsh that is for them as to whether they get through it or whether they fall off the edge and go down with energy stress. Oh, sorry, Jeff. Sorry.
Yeah. You truck drivers in here, they probably can't hear.
Oh, sorry.
We've got the
Should have yelled
microphone.
out halfway through.
Any questions to Tim before we go on to Jim? Yeah?
How effective is mixing, if you're talking about adding magnesium and calcium, can you sort of mix it into the feed when you're trailing it out?
Absolutely. Yeah. And generally I recommend that for feeding grain. You know, use your 1.5% or even up to 2% mineral added to grain. So you can do that in feeders, or you know, if you're trail feeding, you can mix it into the feed. Yeah, absolutely, very effective.
I never have any success with the calcigal that you buy from the supplier when it's too late. I rush in and get it and try and make myself feel good. They live for 2 days and they still die. So
yeah, and so if it's a calcium, if it's purely calcium, you will get more success than if it's preg-tox or lambing sickness.
Right.
Lambing sickness is, you know, like I showed you that photo, you can see the animal's pretty diseased, like, and so it's a lot of effort to get them back. Calcium, you know, you can get the flow pack under the skin, and you know, you might be able to increase their blood calcium levels so they can get back on their feet, go get some food, go get some more mineral, and look after themselves again. Usually with the lamb, you know, pulling the lamb off them, so it's not sucking them dry anymore. But yeah, generally pretty, unfortunately, really low success rates with lambs.
I'm not the
So I
only
would
one.
agree with that.
Yeah, no, not at all. And we've got evaluation sheets, and you've already got your little reward for filling it out, which is a chocolate frog. So I gave it to you first. But one of it is also sharing information between growers. And so with the workshops we've already done, the 3, going back into their evaluation sheets, one of the comments coming through from growers is saying, you know, look, I'm so used to thinking that my ewes are actually looking good in that late stage of pregnancy that I didn't necessarily have them on grain rations going into it, and I hadn't appreciated how little space they've got left in their stomach. So they've got this intake issue, and you know, if there's something I take away from today, it's learning that I start sooner before they get into trouble. And that comment has just kept coming back out of the 3 workshops we've already had.